Today, the inquiry has published its first report on the fire at Grenfell Tower. It covers phase one of its investigations, which were directed to the course of events on the night of the 14th of June 2017. The fire was a terrible tragedy which claimed the lives of many people, so there's an urgent need to understand exactly what happened and how a modern building could have been engulfed by flames and destroyed. In answering that question, the first step is to find out exactly what happened, how the fire started, how it escaped from the flat where it began, and how it spread over the whole building. That has been the focus of phase one of the inquiry, in the course of which I heard evidence from residents who escaped from the burning building, firefighters of all ranks, both those who attended the blaze and those who operated the control room, and representatives of the other emergency services, the council, and the tenant management organisation. I have been greatly assisted by hearing from leading experts in the fields of forensic fire analysis, forensic electrical investigation, fire dynamics, and fire engineering. The evidence I heard over many months has enabled me to reach clear findings about what happened during the early hours of the 14th of June. My report begins with a series of chapters describing the building and its surroundings, its refurbishment, in particular the installation of the cladding and associated work, the basic principles of fire safety design, including the origin of the stay-put strategy, and a broad description of the organisation and operational practices of the London Fire Brigade. These chapters are intended to provide the reader with the information needed to understand what follows, which is a detailed description of the course of events from the outbreak of fire at just before 1 o'clock in the morning until the last survivor left the tower at just after 8 o'clock. This narrative section of the report is long and detailed. It is broken down into separate periods in which I describe, in many cases using the words of the witnesses themselves, the unfolding disaster as it affected those inside the building, those fighting the fire, and those in the control room, which received a flood of emergency calls, both from those in the building and those outside. I also describe the responses of the other emergency services, the council, and the tenant management organisation. This part of the report contains some distressing material, but I considered it important that everyone should understand as clearly as possible the terrifying conditions faced by those who were in the building at the time. Having described in detail the course of events, I turn next to draw my conclusions. I begin with the fire itself. First, its cause and origin, which I find was an electrical fault in the large fridge freezer in the kitchen of flat 16. I make it clear that it occurred without any fault on the part of the tenant, Mr. Kabidi. Then its escape into the cladding through the gaps which opened up around the kitchen windows as a result of the materials deforming in the heat, and then its progress up and around the building. I find that the principal reason why the fire developed so fiercely was the presence of aluminium composite rain screen panels containing a polyethylene core, which is highly combustible. But the insulation boards and other combustible materials also made a contribution. The architectural crown, a decorative feature introduced as part of the refurbishment, played a significant role in enabling the fire to spread around the building. The heat of the fire on the outside of the building was sufficient to break the glazing and allow the fire to enter individual flats. However, one important but difficult question to answer is how smoke from the fire on the exterior of the building was able to penetrate the interior, including the stairs, which provided the only means of escape, as well as the means of access by firefighters to the upper floors. I find that the absence of effective self-closing devices on the entrance doors of some flats allowed smoke from those flats to enter the lobbies and in some cases other flats on the same floor. Once in the lobbies, smoke was able to enter the stairwell when doors were held open by people escaping from the building and by firefighting and rescue operations. The next part of the report is concerned with the response of the London Fire Brigade and the other emergency services. In it, I consider various aspects of the LFB's operations, both in the control room and on the incident ground. I pay tribute to the courage and devotion to duty shown by firefighters who repeatedly entered the building to rescue occupants at great risk to themselves, and also to the unstinting efforts of the control room staff, who were faced with an unprecedented volume of calls, many of which were of a very distressing nature. However, I am critical of many aspects of the LFB's response. Those who are liable to be called upon to act as incident commanders were not trained to recognize a fire in the external wall of a high-rise building, nor were they trained in how to respond to it. There was no contingency plan for evacuation of the tower, and the LFB failed to revoke the stay put advice at a time when the stairs remained passable. Had it done so, more lives could have been saved. There was a lack of effective communication between the control room and the incident commander, resulting in a failure to share important information. There were serious deficiencies in command and control, and many of the communication systems did not work properly. The LFB had not provided its senior control room staff with appropriate training on how to manage an incident which generated a large number of fire survival guidance calls. I consider that these represent significant systemic failings in the organization of the LFB and show that it had failed to learn the lessons of the Lakanal House fire. But at the same time, I find that following the refurbishment, the external walls of the building did not comply with the building regulations because they did not adequately resist the spread of fire over them. On the contrary, they promoted it. Grenfell Tower was home to a strong and vibrant community that was torn apart by the fire. In some cases, whole families died, and many people are mourning relatives, friends, and neighbours with whom they shared their lives. The first stage in the inquiry's proceedings was a series of commemoration hearings held over a period of 2 weeks, at which moving tributes were paid to those who had died. This report would not be complete without a chapter devoted to remembering them as they were in life, and it seemed to me that the best way to do that would be to include the name and a brief description of each person, containing, as far as possible, the essence of what had been said about them at the commemoration hearings. I would like to express on my own behalf and on behalf of the inquiry team as a whole our sorrow at the loss of life caused by the fire, and our heartfelt sympathy for all those who continue to mourn relatives and friends, or whose lives have been changed forever in other ways by this dreadful event. The findings I've made in this report will form the springboard for the next phase of the inquiry, which will consider, among other important things, the design of the cladding and choice of materials, the testing and certification of those materials, and the role of central and local government in promoting fire safety, both by appropriate legislation and guidance, and by ensuring the provision of effective fire and rescue services. All these will be subject to the same level of scrutiny as has been applied in Phase 1. There will also be further consideration of the structure and management of the London Fire Brigade and its preparations for fighting fires in high-rise residential buildings. It is already clear to me, however, that there are steps that can and should be taken now to improve the safety from fire of those who live in high-rise buildings. The report therefore contains a number of recommendations which I hope will lead to improvements in the response to fires in high-rise residential buildings, better understanding by fire and rescue services of the dangers involved in the use of some modern materials, improvements in their ability to recognize fires in high-rise buildings that threaten effective compartmentation, and the introduction of better systems for warning occupants of the need to leave a building when it is necessary to do so, among many other things. In my letter to the Prime Minister, I have said that I confidently expect the government and those responsible for the oversight and governance of the emergency services to implement my recommendations without delay. Anyone reading the report, especially the narrative section, will realise how much evidence has been collected by the inquiry and has now been analysed to produce this report. Most of that evidence has come from individuals, occupants of the tower, firefighters, control room officers and others. I am well aware that it was not easy for them to describe the events of that night and the effect that the fire has had on them, and I know that it was particularly difficult for those who are asked to give evidence in person. I now wish to record my gratitude to all of them for the time and patience they devoted to ensuring that I received a full account of their experiences.